The first time sailors laid eyes on USS Ranger CV-4, many of them did not quite know what to make of her. She did not look like the powerful carriers that would later define the Pacific War. She was small by comparison, narrow in the beam, and carried a flight deck that seemed almost fragile against the vastness of the ocean. She was a product of the early 1930s, a time when the United States was still learning how to build a true carrier force. Ranger was an experiment in steel, a ship built when naval aviation was still young and few people believed aircraft could ever replace battleships. But for all her quirks, the sailors who stepped aboard her during the early years of World War II would come to learn something extraordinary. The little ship was tough, much tougher than she looked. Ranger entered the war not in the warm waters of the Pacific, but in the cold, violent, unpredictable Atlantic. It was a place where storms rose without warning, where waves climbed higher than houses, and where wind howled like a living thing tearing across the sea. Other carriers avoided this ocean when possible. Ranger sailed straight into it. When she left Norfolk on her first wartime missions, the air was sharp and cold, biting the skin of every man on deck. The ship vibrated as her engines pushed her through the swells. Her narrow hull cut the water with surprising agility, but she lacked the weight and size of the fleet carriers that came later. In heavy seas, she flexed. Her flight deck groaned. The metal ribs beneath her wooden planks shuddered like bones under strain. None of that inspired confidence at first. But the sailors soon learned that their ship had a personality. Ranger flexed because she had to. Her hull bent with the waves instead of resisting them, absorbing the energy that might have cracked a more rigid ship. She rode low enough to keep her center of gravity steady even when the sea rose like a wall. She creaked and groaned, but she held together with a stubbornness that surprised everyone. The Atlantic gave her no mercy. During early crossings, the sea rose into towering swells. The flight deck tilted so sharply that sailors could look down and see nothing but a rushing wall of dark water. Waves washed over the bow and smashed against the aircraft lashed to the deck. Planes shifted, ropes strained, and metal fittings snapped under the weight of water. Every gust of wind threatened to shove aircraft sideways across the slick planks. The ship rolled and pitched so violently that sailors had to crawl on hands and knees to avoid being thrown overboard. And still, Ranger pushed forward. The officers in the pilot house watched the storm swallow the horizon, the sky turning the same shade of iron gray as the sea. The captain ordered the ship to hold course. The engines roared against the resistance of the waves, and the little carrier climbed each swell with the determination of something alive. Down below decks, the crew could hear the hull bending. It was not a sound of failure, but of a ship fighting with everything it had. Water slammed against the sides, loose gear clattered, bulkheads groaned. But no cracks formed, no beams snapped, no plates buckled. This first storm set the tone for everything that followed. The sailors expected damage. Instead, they found that the ship had ridden out the worst of it with nothing more than scraped paint and a few battered fittings. One petty officer wrote in his journal that day, "The little carrier does not fear the sea. She dances with it." Ranger did not have the luxury of calm waters. Her missions took her repeatedly across the North Atlantic, escorting convoys, ferrying aircraft, and preparing for operations in Europe. With every crossing came another storm. Some lasted hours, some lasted days. Some struck so suddenly that flight deck crews barely had time to lash down aircraft before the first wave swept across the bow. A normal carrier might have cracked under that pounding, not Ranger. As months passed, the crew began to trust her. They stopped doubting her hull. They stopped worrying about the creaking and groaning that echoed through the lower decks. They understood that those sounds were not signs of weakness, but signs of endurance. Ranger bent, but she refused to break. She became the ship that did the impossible again and again. She survived storms that ripped apart merchant ships and sent destroyers limping back to port. She held course through gales that forced heavy cruisers to alter course. She kept aircraft safe even when the wind was strong enough to tear canvas from metal frames. By the time America prepared for Operation Torch in 1942, Ranger's crew had already given her a name that hinted at their growing admiration. Old Reliable. Not because she was powerful, not because she was big, not because she was advanced, but because she stood against the worst that the Atlantic could summon and came through every time. Other ships rode the ocean. Ranger endured it. And the storms were only the beginning. The storm that truly defined USS Ranger came during one of her earliest wartime crossings, a brutal Atlantic tempest that rose out of the horizon with the kind of sudden fury only sailors of the North Atlantic truly understood. It began as a distant haze that morning, a faint line of gray that most ships might have ignored. But the barometer aboard Ranger began to fall faster than anyone liked, and by noon the wind had sharpened into a cutting force that sliced across the deck. By late afternoon, the horizon had vanished behind a wall of steel-colored clouds. The crew felt the first tremors as swells slapped against the bow. Every man aboard understood what was coming. Ranger did not have the displacement of the great Pacific carriers. She lacked their weight, their broad hulls, their ability to shoulder aside waves like moving mountains. She was lighter, narrower, and rode higher on the water. In a storm, that made her more vulnerable. The officers on the bridge exchanged quiet looks. They had crossed the Atlantic before, but few storms inspired unease the way this one did. As the ship pressed deeper into the heart of the system, the sea rose under her like a living thing. Swells grew from 5 meters to 8, then to 10, then higher still. Rain began to hammer the flight deck in sheets so heavy they blurred the outlines of the aircraft lashed to the planks. Wind screamed across the ship, tearing at ropes, slamming loose gear, and bending antenna masts with savage force. The first wave that struck with full power towered above the bow like a dark cliff. It crashed down with a booming force that sent the entire ship shuddering. Men grabbed whatever they could to stay upright. Tools clattered, doors rattled. Water surged across the deck and poured through scuppers and roaring waterfalls. Below decks, the hull uttered long creaks, the sound of steel bending but not breaking. It was a sound the crew had learned to trust. Ranger flexed under stress the way a seasoned fighter bends under a blow. She yielded slightly, absorbed the force, then returned to shape, but the scale of this storm was unlike anything she had taken before. When the next massive wave struck, the bow plunged deep into the trough. Water shot upward in a plume taller than the island tower. The ship tilted so sharply that one of the SBD Dauntless aircraft on deck broke free from its chocks and slid several feet before the backup cables jerked it to a stop. The deck crew scrambled across the slick planks on hands and knees, fighting the wind to resecure it before the next swell hit. Lightning cracked overhead. Thunder rolled across the ship like cannon fire. The storm was now in full fury. Up in the bridge, the captain ordered all watertight doors secured. Every compartment went into storm readiness. Damage control teams spread out across the ship, waiting for the inevitable. In heavy seas, the weakest weakness could become a fatal one. But Ranger had few such weaknesses. Her frame had been built in an era when designers still overbuilt ships simply because they did not yet know how far they could push naval aviation. Now, that overbuilding might save her life. As twilight disappeared into blackness, the ship met the storm head-on. Each wave rose higher than the last. 15-meter swells hurled themselves at the hull with merciless force. The ship bucked like a living creature trying to climb out of the sea itself. The bow rose high into the air, hung for a moment, then dropped into the trough with a violent crash that sent shudders deep into the keel. Several sailors later said they heard a sound like the snapping of giant bones as the ship twisted under the strain, but when the lights flickered back to full strength and the deck steadied,
It became clear that nothing had broken. The flight deck had bowed under the weight of the waves, bending downward, but it had bent the way a tree bends in a storm, remaining intact where a more rigid structure might have snapped. Below decks, the aviation crews fought to secure aircraft that shifted with each violent roll. Every loose object had to be tied down, every cable had to be checked repeatedly. Men worked with their hands numb from cold, soaked through by condensation and seawater that sprayed through ventilation openings. Still, the storm grew worse. One destroyer in the escort screen radioed that it had suffered hull damage from a rogue wave. Another reported engine trouble. A third ship fell behind and was ordered to turn away for safety. Ranger, however, kept pushing forward, her bow cutting through the monstrous seas like a blade through wet canvas. In the engineering spaces, the crew braced themselves against consoles as the ship slammed from peak to trough. The boilers held firm, the turbines continued to spin with steady power, the machinery vibrated violently at times, but it did not falter. One machinist mate shouted above the roar that the old girl seemed angrier at the storm than afraid of it. Just after midnight came the worst moment. A wave so high it blocked the sky itself rose ahead of the ship. It struck with such force that water washed up and over the island tower. The entire ship lurched, alarms sounded, men were thrown from their feet, tools scattered. One aircraft in the hangar broke loose and slid dangerously close to the elevator shaft before chocks halted its path. But when the water drained off the flight deck and the ship righted herself, she was still intact. Not a single major beam had cracked, not a single bulkhead had buckled, not a single pilot lost because the ship had failed him. In the logbook, a bridge officer wrote words that would define Ranger for the rest of her career. The little carrier bent, but she did not break. By dawn, the worst of the storm had passed. Ranger emerged battered, soaked, and covered in salt crust, but completely operational. Her crew stood on the deck that morning in quiet amazement. They had just survived a storm that could have torn lesser ships into pieces. And the legend of Old Reliable truly began.
By the time Ranger completed her first brutal Atlantic crossing, something had changed among the men who lived and worked aboard her. They no longer spoke of the ship with cautious respect or nervous uncertainty. They spoke of her with trust, real trust, the kind that sailors usually reserve only for the most proven vessels. The storm that should have twisted her hull or split her deck had instead revealed a truth no design blueprint could ever show. Ranger might have been small, she might have been underpowered compared to the giants that came later, but she was tough. Tough in a way no one had fully understood until they felt her survive the Atlantic's worst fury and come out whole. The nickname began quietly. A machinist mate in the engine room muttered it first when the ship steadied after the storm's final blow. Old Reliable. The name spread faster than most sailors' jokes. Within days, it was everywhere. Officers used it during briefings. Deck crews used it as they lashed down aircraft. Pilots used it before stepping onto the wet flight deck. Even men who had once doubted the ship found themselves using it without irony. Old Reliable. It fit her perfectly. Ranger did not impress with size or raw power. What impressed the sailors was how she responded when everything around her screamed to give up. A lesser ship might have cracked in two. A newer, heavier carrier might have torqued its frame under the same strain. But Ranger had ridden those 15-meter waves by bending and absorbing the force, not resisting it. In the months that followed, the crew grew accustomed to the ship's strange blend of fragility and strength. Her flight deck groaned in high seas, and her hull flexed in ways that startled new sailors. But every time they inspected her afterward, they found the same thing. No structural failures, no broken beams, no signs that the storm had inflicted real harm. The damage control crews quickly became experts in managing the storms. They were not simply good at their jobs, they were exceptional. Many of them had served on older carriers or cruisers, but Ranger taught them an entirely different art.
On most ships, damage control meant reacting to emergencies. On Ranger, it meant anticipating the sea's next blow. When another Atlantic storm threatened in early 1943, the ship braced long before the first swells rose. Men tightened every bolt they could reach. Lashings were doubled. Extra cables were run across the deck. In the hangar, aircraft were lashed with enough redundancy to survive a hurricane. Sailors learned to wedge wooden blocks under wheels and secure control surfaces. Engineers reinforced loose fittings, checked welds, and tested pumps and generators repeatedly. They knew what was coming. And then it came. The second great storm of Ranger's wartime career began with a sudden drop in pressure and winds so cold they whipped straight through wool coats. The sea rose with the same merciless speed as before. The bow lunged upward and plunged downward with violent sweeps that made men clutch rails and pipes just to stay upright. As the storm raged, a Wildcat fighter changed to the bow, snapped one of its tie-downs, and slid dangerously close to the deck edge. The deck crew crawled through blinding spray to secure it. A wave nearly swept 2 men off the deck, but they clung to the arresting gear and held on until help arrived. Below, water seeped into the hangar through vents, forcing men to work ankle-deep as they fought to secure every aircraft and piece of equipment. Sparks flew from loose electrical fittings until they were tightened. Loose barrels rolled until secured. Fuel drums slammed against bulkheads until chocks were repositioned. Yet through all the chaos, one thing remained constant. No matter how hard the ocean hit her, Ranger steadied herself again and again. Her keel flexed under the weight of the storm, but did not deform. Her frames groaned but did not crack. Her welds screamed under pressure but held fast. Men listened to the ship like men listening to the breathing of a companion fighting for survival. One sailor wrote in his diary that night, "The ship sounds like she is hurting, but she is still singing, and as long as she sings, we know she will not fail us." The storm raged for nearly 20 hours. When it finally ended, dawn broke across a sea still rolling with leftover swells. The crew gathered on the battered deck and stared at their ship. Ranger was bruised but unbroken. Several stanchions had bent, a few planks were warped, rails mangled, but her hull was still whole. Her flight deck was still intact, and not one aircraft had been lost to structural failure. Not one pilot had died because the ship had betrayed him. It became a point of pride, something whispered in hangar bays and spoken openly in ready rooms. Other carriers had lost planes over the side during storms. Other ships had suffered cracked decks, twisted frames, or worse. But Ranger, the smallest and lightest of the American fleet carriers, had kept every man safe through 2 tempests that could have swallowed her whole. Pilots in particular came to love the ship. They knew that landing on Ranger in high seas was harder than landing on a large Essex class. The deck was shorter, the ship pitched more dramatically, the arresting gear slammed harder. But they also knew that the ship would never fail beneath them. There were moments when the deck rose so high during a landing attempt that the pilot saw nothing but sky, and moments when it fell so low he saw nothing but a towering wall of water. But the little carrier always caught them. Old Reliable earned her name in every storm, every landing, every crossing. By mid-1943, the sailors no longer called her a small carrier. They called her a survivor, a fighter, a ship with a soul not made of steel, but of stubbornness. And the Atlantic was far from finished testing her.
By late 1942, USS Ranger had already earned the respect of every sailor who walked her decks. She had faced the worst storms the Atlantic could summon, and she had proven that she could bend without breaking. But now she was about to face a different kind of test, not the violence of the sea, but the violence of war. Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa, would be Ranger's moment to prove that her reputation as Old Reliable applied not only to storms, but to combat. In the days leading up to the landings in Morocco, the weather around Ranger turned foul once again. The Atlantic brewed another storm, smaller than the monsters she had survived before, but fierce enough to challenge her stability at a critical moment. Rain hammered the flight deck, waves surged against the hull.
Winds tore across the bow and shook the aircraft tied to the deck. For most carriers, launching aircraft in such conditions would have been difficult, if not impossible. But Ranger had no intention of letting the weather decide the battle. Pilots and deck crews stood ready in their soaked jackets, gripping the rails as the carrier pitched through the swells. One officer noted that the ship felt more alive in the storm than calm seas, as if she thrived on chaos. On the morning of November 8th, as dawn broke through the heavy clouds, Ranger turned into the wind. Her bow rose and fell like a hammer striking the ocean, yet her engines held her steady enough to begin launching aircraft. The first F-4F Wildcat roared down the slick deck, wings trembling in the wind. The ship lurched upward at the worst possible moment, nearly throwing the fighter off balance. But the pilot held steady, and the little ship caught him with a burst of wind that lifted him into the sky. The men on deck erupted in cheers. If Ranger could launch aircraft in seas like this, she could launch them anywhere. Next came the SPD Dauntless dive bombers, loaded with ordnance bound for Vichy French positions around Casablanca. Each one rolled forward with a hiss of wheels on wet planks, engines straining to lift off before the deck dropped away again. Ranger's deck crew timed each launch with the rhythm of the waves. They waited for the deck to rise, braced themselves, and sent each aircraft into the storm-gripped sky. By mid-morning, the little carrier had launched more than 60 aircraft, an astonishing feat given the conditions. One pilot later wrote that taking off from Ranger during Operation Torch felt like riding a Bronco made of steel and salt water. Ranger's aircraft hit their targets with precision. Wildcats strafed enemy airfields. Dauntless bombers dove on ships in the harbor. TBF Avengers struck coastal batteries. The air battle raged for hours, and through it all, Ranger maintained her position offshore, stable enough to recover returning aircraft despite the heaving sea. Pilots landing back aboard faced a harrowing challenge. The deck pitched so violently that arresting wires swung like loose cables. The landing signal officer stood firm, soaked to the bone, waving his paddles with confidence as if the storm did not exist. Wildcat and Dauntless pilots circled nervously above the carrier, waiting for the right moment to descend. When the first aircraft touched down, the ship pitched forward so suddenly that the landing gear nearly collapsed, but the hook caught the wire and the plane stopped just meters from the deck edge. The pilot climbed out shaking, drenched, and laughing in disbelief. Old Reliable had caught him once again. The success of Operation Torch turned Ranger into a legend among the carrier crews of the Atlantic Fleet. She had launched and recovered aircraft under conditions that would have grounded larger, more modern ships. She had done it without suffering structural damage, without losing a single pilot to deck failure, and without compromising the mission. In the months that followed, Ranger continued to serve across the Atlantic and later ferried aircraft to distant bases. Each voyage brought new storms, and each storm only reinforced the crew's faith in their ship. She helped protect convoys. She trained new pilots. She patrolled harsh seas where no other carrier was trusted to operate. It became almost a joke among the fleet that if the weather turned foul, Ranger would be the only ship still fully operational. Destroyers limped, cruisers altered course, even battleships took precautions. But Ranger always pushed forward, her bow slicing into the waves with the stubborn determination that had earned her reputation. By 1944, when she supported operations in the North Atlantic and trained British pilots for their strikes against German shipping, the legend was complete. Every man who served aboard her knew he was riding a ship that had beaten the sea itself. Ranger was not fast. She was not large. She was not especially modern. But she had something no other carrier possessed in such abundance: a soul of iron, a will to endure, and a reputation for always coming back. Old Reliable had proven herself not through glory in the Pacific, but through survival in the unforgiving Atlantic, where nature itself seemed determined to break her. And she had survived it all. But her greatest legacy was still to come.
By the time the war entered its final chapters, USS Ranger had already earned something far greater than official commendations or operational citations. She had earned a reputation. Not a reputation built on dramatic battles or headline victories, but one forged in the relentless, icy grip of the Atlantic Ocean itself. The men who sailed her knew that Ranger was different. She was not the biggest carrier. She was not the fastest. She was not the most advanced. But she was the one that simply refused to break, no matter how violently the sea tried to tear her apart. And for sailors, that mattered more than anything. As newer and larger carriers like the Essex class began dominating the Pacific, Ranger's role shifted. She served as a training vessel for pilots preparing to join the war. She ferried aircraft across thousands of miles. She stood watch in the North Atlantic, where German U-boats still hunted convoys. Through it all, she sailed into weather so brutal that many ships simply avoided those waters entirely. Her legacy grew stronger each time she returned to port, battered but intact. In the cold months of early 1944, Ranger weathered yet another storm off the coast of Iceland. The swells rose so high they seemed to swallow the sky. Some waves crashed over the flight deck with such force that aircraft lashed down in the hangar deck trembled from the impact. The ship rolled so far that sailors swore they could feel the deck tilt beneath their boots like a sliding platform. Yet despite the violence, Ranger stayed in formation while other ships were forced to slow or divert. When she reached port days later, British officers examined her out of curiosity. They expected to find cracked beams or twisted frames or fractured supports. Instead, they found a ship worn, yes, but solid. The hull seams were intact. The internal frame showed no compromise. The deck had warped slightly but returned to shape once the seas calmed. A Royal Navy officer famously remarked that Ranger behaved like a small steel willow tree, bending in the wind but never snapping. During one training operation in 1945, Ranger rode out a storm so severe that several escort ships temporarily lost power from the repeated pounding of the waves. One destroyer limped behind the task group, radioing that she had suffered hull damage from a rogue wave. Ranger, by contrast, pressed forward with engines steady and flight deck crews ready to respond at a moment's notice. The storm battered her, but like always, she survived without significant damage. Her pilots trusted her. This was perhaps the greatest part of her legacy. Ranger never lost a single pilot due to structural failure. Not one landing gear collapse, not one arresting cable failure attributed to hull deformity, not one deck buckling incident that hurled aircraft overboard. Pilots who trained on Ranger often said that if they could land on her in foul weather, they could land on anything. After the war, when the United States evaluated its fleet, many early carriers were retired quickly due to age or structural fatigue. Lightweight carriers, in particular, often showed signs of stress from the constant pounding of operational tempo. But when the Navy examined Ranger, they found something unexpected. Her keel remained true. Her internal frames remained straight. Her welded seams remained stronger than predicted. Her deck, though scarred and weathered, showed no structural fractures. Her machinery spaces were still clean, aligned, and mechanically sound. Engineers studying her hull concluded that despite surviving more severe weather than almost any other American carrier of the war, Ranger remained one of the least structurally damaged carriers of the war. It was almost embarrassing for the designers who had originally dismissed her as too small, too light, too experimental. The ship they had once underestimated proved to be one of the most resilient carriers the Navy ever put to sea. In the years after 1945, Ranger never found her way into the grand stories of the Pacific War, nor did she participate in the final bombardments of Japan. But among the men who sailed the Atlantic and faced its roaring tempests, she was remembered as the ship that defied nature itself. She trained thousands of pilots. She escorted convoys the Germans tried to strangle.
She supported combat in North Africa. She survived storms that cracked hulls, tore superstructures, flooded engine rooms, and snapped destroyers in half. And she did it without ever failing the men who depended on her. Decades later, sailors who served aboard her would still speak of her with reverence. They would describe the sound of her hull groaning in the dark as another wave hit. They would describe the sight of her bow rising out of a wall of water like a defiant fist. They would describe the feel of the deck trembling but holding firm beneath their boots. Above all, they would describe the unshakable bond they felt with the ship, the belief that no matter how bad the storm became, Ranger would find a way to bring them home. When historians wrote her story, they focused on her limitations, her size, her experimental design, but the sailors told a different story. They told of a carrier that refused to break, a carrier that protected them not only from the enemy, but from the wrath of an unforgiving ocean. A carrier that earned the only name that ever truly mattered: Old Reliable. The Atlantic tested her again and again with waves that should have torn her in half, but she held. And in doing so, she earned her place among the great survivors of the sea.